Hi everyone and welcome. Today is the 26th of March 2025 and I am joined by Michael Hudson, a household name in the world of economics. I guess the world is changing very rapidly, we see. The US seems to be adjusting to multipolarity. It needs to have a new priorities. Europe seemingly is less of a priority, while there seems to be a need to make peace with Russia. And we see that on the European side, rather than, I guess, pulling back from the proxy war against Russia, the Europeans insist now that they will continue the war without the United States, which again is a bit doubtful, but it also gets worse. Using money they don't have to build weapons that won't be produced for many years. And again, the purpose of defeating Russia, which isn't clearly defined how that would actually work. So a lot of this doesn't make sense, and a lot of people have been trying to make sense of it. Um, how do you see, I guess, the economic and political narratives that has led Europe down this path?
Well, you're quite right, Glenn, when you say it doesn't make sense. And the situation today is very different. When I began 60 years ago as an economist, and I stopped calling myself an economist and began calling myself a futurist when I worked with the Hudson Institute and the Futures Group. And being a futurist, you could go beyond economics. And it was very easy to explain why countries were acting in the way they acted. You just said, well, what's their self-interest? And if they understood what their self-interest was, then you just plan it all out and say, well, does it intersect with other countries' self-interest? How do you put them together? And obviously, as you've discussed all along and just said, the seemingly obvious European, especially German self-interest is to be complementary with Russia to do exactly what it was doing for the last few decades to get energy from Russia and give Russia what it needs industrial goods, industrial investment to make its own cars and automobiles and consumer goods. So the real question is how do you explain why Europe seems not to be acting in its self interest and taking this bellicose Cold War split that it's doing today? Well, you pointed out before that it's all about the narrative, that somehow there is a false narrative that overwhelms the natural reality. And I think it's natural for people to understand what is reality, and it's more difficult to make them twist it around into accept a false narrative. And I've been trying to figure out why would Europe and especially Germany and especially the new leader Merz from BlackRock have this idea that the future of Europe lies in fighting with Russia. And I think I've got the answer. And that is they have a false economic narrative that underlines everything, a false worldview. And it's the worldview that underlies the way that the Eurozone was set up. It's a false economic view. And it's called, in America, we call that military Keynesianism. The idea that if you spend money on the military budget, that's going to create investment and employment. And that is a way of injecting government money into the economy by running deficits. Well, the problem for Europe is the Eurozone's rule that prevents it from running a deficit of more than just, I think, 5% of GDP. And Europe, especially right now, has so many social spending programs that it needs, including subsidizing families so that they can afford to buy the energy that they're not buying from Russia anymore, but have to buy from the United States at 4 times the price at LNG, liquefied natural gas. How do you get around this? Well, think of what Donald Trump was trying to get Europe to do, saying, "Well, you've got to believe the framework, the myth that Russia is going to attack Europe and trying to recreate the old Soviet empire. Well, we know that that's not the case because no country can afford to invade another country, a big country, anymore. It would take 10 or 20 million Russian troops. And the big thing is, Europe doesn't have anything now that Russia particularly wants. But what I think Mertz's idea is, well, if we say that we are defending ourselves against an enemy, then all of a sudden we have a national security excuse for going beyond the constraint of the Eurozone on how much money we can spend. And if we say that we're spending militarily, I think he's talked about almost €1 trillion on spending rearmament on European industry, then somehow that is going to spur German, French, maybe even English economic recovery. Well, that's the obvious question is, do you really need to go to war or have a war-like narrative in order just to enable the government to pump money into the economy to promote a Keynesian policy of economic recovery? Obviously, Europe needs to recover right now economically. It's in a mess. Its industry's been closing down because of the end of Nord Stream and the end of importing from Russia. There's a kind of idea that only economists would have, a kind of tunnel vision that thinks that it's somehow if you pump money into the economy, it's all going to be amorphous and fungible and turned into GDP, and that can be a recovery. And the only way that I can explain why Europe is following such an unrealistic policy to believe that it has to conjure up fears of war with Russia over Ukraine, and indeed sabotages any attempt by the United States to end its conflict with Russia so it can pursue other conflicts elsewhere, is this tunnel vision of economists that think that somehow you have to go to war in order to let the government spend money into the economy to revive the economy, as if that's going to revive the economy. Well, you can just imagine the silliness of thinking almost a trillion euros for arms. It's going to take many years to do this, many years of investment. All right, that investment's going to employ labor and expand the economy. And but the problem is, who's going to buy the arms? The only producing arms is not like producing washing machines and cars, which consumers can use. It's not like producing capital goods and machinery that investors can use. There's really no use for arms except to have them destroyed by other people going to war with each other. And it really is, it's the West that's going to war with the rest of the world. I don't think the rest of the world has many needs for arms except to defend itself against the new Cold War from the West. And so obviously you're not going to have Asia and the United States buying European arms to fight each other. So Europe is producing all of this enormous investment instead of investing in increasing living standards and increasing production of consumer goods or capital goods. It's producing useless goods, and this is how economists think. They don't think of use values. They don't think of a critical path analysis of what do we need in order to get prosperity. It's sort of the neoliberal junk economics of sort of a bastardized Keynesianism. And I think if you, the only way that you can explain why Europe is acting so much against its self-interest is it's the tunnel vision of thinking like an economist.
Yes, interesting. You would mention the military Keynesianism. The former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis, he also warns that this is a dead end, especially then for the Germans. This idea that you just build enough weapons and this will create jobs, and with the jobs there's money, and then suddenly you have an economy. But Europe has some real problems, though, in terms of deindustrialization. Indeed, this is a very critical time to have these economic problems because the industries of the world are largely shifting now. That is, with the digitalization, we're entering what many refer to as the fourth industrial revolution, in which the digital technologies get more ability to manipulate the physical world, and it's this point in time where we should really be investing in technologies of the future, trying to catch up a bit with the Americans and the Chinese. But instead of industrializing, we're now going to prepare for war instead. And as for the Germans, they can't build cars anymore competitively. So now the idea is that they should make tanks instead. But this is not how economics works, as you say. This is you're literally building things which should be blown up. But what do you see with uh, the motivation of concentrating power? Because it does occur to me that making very hawkish radicals such as Kaja Kallas to be the EU foreign policy chief, a person who says she doesn't believe in diplomacy, she wants to destroy Russia, break it up in pieces. Indeed, there's more and more criticism towards her now that she's her, I guess, very vile rhetoric. It goes well beyond what the EU has a consensus around the language that should be used. But I say this because in 1870 to 1871, you had this Franco-Prussian War. It's often argued that if the Germans didn't provoke it, at least they took advantage of it, because by having this external threat, they were able to then bring together the German states. Do you see this also being, I guess we are speculating to some extent, but as a possible motivation?
Well, if
Or
that's motivation, it's certainly backfiring because what you're seeing now is that the strains of the this German, French, British new Cold War militarism is breaking up the European community. And one of the reasons is, well, when you mention Ms. Callas and her friend von der Leyen, you see, how is it that the EU leadership can be so pro-war, whereas the voters of Europe, especially in Germany, but throughout Europe, don't want war. How is it that the EU bureaucracy is able to put in warmongers who have a almost a traumatic hatred of Russia, an emotional hate, wanting to go to war with them that is not shared by the voters and the population at large. Well, the result is, I think that at some point you're already having Hungary, the Czechs, even questions by Maloney and many Frenchmen. Do we really want to be a part of this? How can we? Is it possible that we can remain in the whole political way in which the European community has been structured, whereas somehow unelected war hawks like Callas and von der Leyen are in charge of European foreign policy, and they've put all of their fellow neocons and neoliberals along with them in the European community. The EU leadership is as if the EU leadership is opposed to the individual countries. How long can Europe really stay together without countries beginning to withdraw? Already, Hungary has said, well, we're going to veto these levies on us to try to fight Russia. We don't want to fight Russia. We want gas from Russia. We want the way it used to be before 2022. other countries are saying the same thing. So this what you've described is actually splitting up Europe, and it looks like the only way that Europe can escape from this false narrative and this false economics is by somehow breaking it up and starting all over again with a new structure. And you look at how did all this come to be in the first place? Well, it was largely U.S. influence, the way that Europe shaped the United States pressed a design of Europe, not only the Eurozone with its monetary rules, following University of Chicago, sort of right-wing economics, but the whole politics way going back to Operation Gladio in Italy and other countries. The United States has been sponsoring through the non-governmental organizations all sort of the political leadership of Europe today. That is how people like Baerbock and the Greens somehow got promoted. People that you think, how can these people ever have sort of risen and gotten so many credentials? And well, a lot of that's by U.S. maneuvering to do to Europe what it did with putting Tony Blair in, for instance, in England. The idea is to make all of, to find Tony Blairs for Germany, France, Italy, and other countries who will sort of be very loyal to the U.S. Policy and the Cold War. And that loyalty to the U.S. is what's splitting up Europe today. Well, you've seen the European politicians to say, no, we're breaking away from the United States. The United States wants peace and peace with, or at least Trump wants peace with Putin, but we certainly don't. And we're not going to spend this 5% of our GDP on military arms on buying American arms. As Donald Trump had hoped, we're going to spend it on buying German arms or so. And there's a kind of uh, an attempt to use this anti-Americanism to sort of reinforce what they think is a way of solidifying the European countries, but it's not re-solidifying it. And especially as the economic situation gets worse and worse, as Germany reindustrializes and loses its heavy industry, its fertilizer industry, all the industries that were dependent on imports of raw materials from Russia, and as Europe agrees with the United States to cut itself off from China and trade with China. It's not exactly in its own self-interest, but it's in the idea of its self-interest based on this kind of false narrative. It's a false economic narrative as well as a false political narrative. And that's the problem. And given the role of the mass media in Germany and other countries, you're not really getting much of the other side of the issue. And you've just seen in Germany trying to talk, well, let's ban the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, just like other countries, just like Romania is trying to ban the anti-war candidates. You're having a suspension of liberty, and you're also having Germany ban advocates of peace in Gaza, defenders of Gaza, or just Germans who say, we don't want genocide, we want peace. All of this is being banned, and visitors who are coming to give speeches or discussion of the war in Gaza are turned away. You're having this antithesis of everything that the cover story of the European Union of prosperity and democracy was supposed to promote.
And yeah, I'm always thinking that part of the problem for the Europeans is also they got trapped in narratives. I spoke recently with yeah, George Beebe, the former CIA director for Russia analysis, and he has an interesting article where he was going somewhat in the same direction as the Europeans have now really locked themselves in a corner with this idea that it's an unprovoked full-scale invasion to wipe Ukraine off the map. It's a new Hitler. Attempting to restore the Soviet Union, all of these narratives which have been spun, and it is interesting because this has kind of been Trump's key strength. He seems to be able to yeah, just ignore everything. He ignores key narratives. He just begins to push interests where other politicians will be trapped, I guess, into these common narratives. Now, what's fascinating with the Europeans is they were pulled to a bit extent along with Biden, because keep in mind, for all these years, the Europeans they were very well aware that all this NATO expansionism, especially Ukraine, was a red line, something that would likely trigger a war. But again, they got on board with the Biden train, which was, yeah, as anti-Russian as could be. And I think the Europeans prepared themselves as well. That is, they made Kaja Kallas, again, not the brightest tool in the shed, but she's a wartime leader, they said. She's very hawkish on Russia. This is what we need. And now it's very difficult to steer the ship around. And as you suggested as well, there's lack of independent media in these days in Europe as well. So there's very little ability to challenge the narrative-driven media with actual facts. It's yeah, it's very hard to turn around, but at some point, certainly it has to be forced around, doesn't it? Because while many Europeans now have this great ambition to learn to live without the Americans, again, Kaya Kallas, she made a statement that the free world needs a new leader. So we're done with America. This is not again, she talks a big game, but she's not a prime minister or anything. We have independent nation states in Europe, and not the whole continent is ready to break off with the Americans, especially the British. They seem to be, again, more hawkish on Russia, but they're also would like to be the main partner of America. So there will be huge fragmentations in here. And I also wonder how comfortable, again, Poland is one of the most anti-Russian countries we have on the continent as well. But if Germany is going to arm itself to the teeth again, does Poland want to divorce itself from the United States, which is kind of its safety blanket when it's stuck between the Germans and the Russians? I just don't see unity in Europe based on this, yeah, going against both the Russians and Americans at the same time. Indeed, you might end up in a horror situation for the Europeans where the Americans and Russians come together to put pressure on the Europeans for not falling in line on the Ukraine issue. Um, but I wanted to ask you about the feasibility of this whole thing because obviously Europe or the Europeans are in panic. We see France, Germany, and Britain. They will arm themselves. Financial Times wrote recently that the main challenge now was to convert European welfare states to warfare states, and suggesting that they might need a heavy dose of war propaganda if you're going to have the public consent to this. What are the political and economic considerations here? Do you see this as
Well,
being feasible?
a warfare state is not a state, as the name implies, that is going to provide welfare for the population at large. So, what are they going to vote for? Are they going to vote for their self-interest, which is better living standards, or are they going to say, well, okay, we're going to pay higher prices for the gas and for electricity? And for heating our homes, we're going to have much lower living standards, but it's all worth it really just to fight Russia. Well, you're going to have a conflict between the narrative of we need war in order to save the world and the reality of, well, somebody's going to make a big sacrifice, and also the reality of other countries' response, especially France is the danger, and England are the dangerous triggers here. President Putin has said, all right, they're going to be more active in providing Ukraine with missiles, long distance missiles. that can hit Russian territory. And I think a month ago, Putin came out and said, we're not going to pretend that all this fighting in Ukraine is about Ukraine. It's really about NATO and behind NATO, the United States wanting to break up Europe and divide Europe. And since we know that the fight's NATO, and in Europe that it's led by Macron in France and now Starmer in Britain, if a missile made by France or England hits Russia, we're going to respond not against the Ukrainian territory that launched it, but against the country that made the missile. We're going to respond against Britain. Will it be London? Will it be some British manufacturing territory? Will it be Paris or one of the Parisian military production plants? So there's a possibility of a Russian response that realizes this is just a charade to pretend that all of this fighting is in Ukraine. That's the point that Putin and Lavrov have been making in their discussions with the Americans. They're saying, look, forget Ukraine. We really would be better off not even discussing it right now. Let's talk about the whole roots of the Cold War. Let's talk about the fact that when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, NATO should have been dismantled also. That's when Putin said maybe, and the Russians said maybe we should join NATO and all be together. They want to go back to try to undo this whole salami carving up Russia bit by bit and deal with the underlying economic structure. That's what the European governments are against. And if they're against going back and destructuring the whole Cold War apparatus, economic apparatus and political apparatus that's been put in place since 1991, this cannot be done smoothly. It's got to there has to be some sort of trigger of consciousness. There has to be a critical mass of the population realizing what the problem is. Well, you're seeing this to some extent in Germany, but they're really, from my point of view, the only party that has a reality-based economics is this Sarah Wagenknecht group, and she hardly got to the 5% cutoff point where to get into into the government. So it's like Europe is in a pre-collapse situation, a pre-crisis situation. But in the end, you cannot keep a false narrative going when reality becomes stronger and stronger, and the gap between the reality and the narrative becomes so strained that finally people realize that doesn't work. Well, what you need is an alternative to be put forth. And there are political alternatives. Yes, let's not fight with Russia, but there hasn't been an economic alternative to if we don't fight with Russia, then how are we going to reestablish prosperity in Germany and in the other European countries if it's not by producing more military goods? How are we going to restructure the economy in a better way than the way in which the Eurozone was set up originally? Without an economic discussion of that kind of alternative, you're seeing Germany and Europe just go into a blind alley that is getting tighter and tighter, and at some point just has to explode. I mean, the real question is, does Europe really have to go to war to be able to spend money creation into the economy to employ labor and somehow reindustrialize? And how can it even reindustrialize and make arms without getting gas and energy and oil and other raw materials from Russia, and without trading with China. How can it reindustrialize in the world if it's cutting itself off from the rest of the world that's growing so much more rapidly, and even from the United States? How can it go it alone when it's already deindustrialized so much, when it's already cut off its what would seem to be all of its natural potential sources of strength that it's now lost? There's no realistic way of explaining it except that they have a set of false assumptions and false ideas of how an economy or even a society works.
It seems to be also some distortion about the image of the Europe itself versus the rest of the world, because we see now the EU being quite hawkish on China, and and then suddenly the Europeans would like to get some cooperation going. They invited Xi Jinping to come over to Brussels, and he's not going to come. And part of the reason is the way the Europeans have been behaving as well. But the assumption kind of appears to have been, we play tough with the Chinese, and then we offer the carrot and invite them over, and then they would come running. But it turns out that it's not happening anymore. I think it's very difficult for the Europeans to adjust to this new world because, again, it's been almost 500 years of a very European-centric world where the Europeans, we have been the subject, the rest of the world were the objects. We got to organize the whole world around us, and now suddenly it's been turned on its head a bit. As they say, we no longer we don't have a seat at the table. We find ourselves on the menu instead. It's a bit strange to see. Again, that's why the Ukraine war is so interesting because now you have the Americans and the Russians effectively negotiating a peace in Europe. So moving the pieces around, and the Europeans find out that yeah, they don't have a seat at the table. They are the new pieces. It appears this would be an ideal time to revisit some of the mistakes we did after the Cold War. Because after the Cold War, a lot of European countries realized that this would, also America, by the way, that redividing the continent and returning to the bloc politics, that this would revive the Cold War. But while it would alienate and create conflicts with the Russians, at least it would cement America's presence in Europe. But now that the United States is planning to reorient itself, it's very openly saying you're not a priority anymore. We're not left with the Americans anymore. We're just left with the conflict with Russia, and it kind of begs the question: what is the point of this? Uh, but I did pick up on something you said, which was used the word collapse, and I don't see that as being an exaggeration because if we're going to have this economic plan which doesn't work, that is cut ourselves off from every center of power and then arm ourselves. It Yeah, to also get the population to accept the idea that yeah, the good times are over, there's no more welfare and prosperity because now we have to tighten our belts to fight Russia. In order to sell this story, you need too much propaganda. There's not going to be an ability to pursue basic national interest. You're going to have more political dissent, which has to be undermined. The narrative has to be elevated above the facts, and the economics doesn't work. The politics won't fit anymore. And as you said, eventually reality will catch up and punch some holes in the narrative. And then, do you think it's a possibility that if not Europe, at least the EU could move towards a collapse?
Well, we're in a pre-collapse situation. Before you have a collapse, there's going to be a slow crash. It's going to be the current trend is going to mean that living standards and industrial profits and employment is getting slowly worse and worse and worse, and there can't be a crash until you have a revolutionary situation. And a revolutionary situation is you have an alternative. And without an alternative, there's not a crash. There's just a slow crash, a slow tightening, slowly going down as the economy deteriorates. And you mentioned at the beginning of what you just said, Europe wants to get tough with China. You can't get tough with China. You can't threaten China or Russia because there's nothing that China or Russia needs in Europe. That's what really is so shocking to the European mentality, that the world can get along without Europe at all. Putin and Lavrov said, we'd hoped to have a symbiotic relationship with European industry, technology, and complementary economies, but we realize that isn't work. So we've reshifted our focus eastward to Eurasia and to the BRICS, and we realize now that we don't need Europe anymore. Now that Europe has lost the industrial appeal that it had before Nord Stream in 2022, there's really nothing that it has to offer. And we certainly don't want to take it over because it would be an albatross for whoever takes Europe as a protectorate under its wings. We don't want that. Now, it's very hard, I think, for Europeans to realize that they're not needed anymore, that they've lost their place in the world. I think most politicians in every country try to do what Trump has said, make America great again. In Europe, they'll say, well, make Europe great again. Or Europe is great, or let's recover our greatness. But they've taken steps that seem so irreversible that they can't do anything. And what they've created is I won't say a counter narrative on the part of Russia and China, because narratives are usually artificial, false views of the world, but a counter reality. And I think that last week, Foreign Minister Lavrov said, here is how Russia and our allies are viewing Europe. It's a brief quote. What he said was, over the past 500 years, when the West was more or less formed in the form in which it has survived to this day, all the tragedies of the world originated in Europe or happened thanks to European politics, colonialism, wars, crusaders, the Crimean War, Napoleon, the First World War, Adolf Hitler. All of that came from Europe. Well, President Putin, in his way, have said, well, all this goes really back to the 11th century when the Great Schism in the Roman Church broke from the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople, and the Romans said, we have to take over Christianity. We have to create a united Europe under the control of Rome. And so the first thing they did after about 1051 or so, when they had the Great Schism, was they began to say, how are we going to defeat and destroy Turkey, Constantinople, and by extension, all the areas that the Orthodox Church controlled? Well, the answer was they hired Norman warlords in Europe and said the first warlord they hired was in the 1070s. And when they went to one of them and said, "Well, we'll give you southern Italy and Sicily." Which right now is a Byzantine area. If you get rid of the Byzantines and make that Catholic, we'll bless you as the king. They then went to William, the conqueror of England, and said, well, if you conquer England, right now it's not really paying us very much money. We will bless you as the king of England if you pledge fealty to Rome. And the whole Crusades was really a crusade to destroy the Greek Orthodox Church in Spain, in southern Italy, in the Balkan area, in every area. The Romans Church had warlords taking over, uh, and in order to finance it, their military spending. The church abolished its opposition to usury. It created international banking to finance war lending. And you can see how this whole attempt to integrate Europe from the very beginning is an alternative to what was the economic center of the day, the prosperous center, which was Constantinople and its prosperity that was spreading further eastward. Well, in that sense, the Russians are looking at Europe and saying, well, we thought that there could be peace, but there's not only this underlying religious difference, which to Putin seems to be very important, but there's also a cultural difference that we are very much like China. We're trying to achieve alliance with other countries by mutual gain, win-win situation. What can we offer you in exchange for your integrating your economy and politics, and hence your political and military alignment with us? The Western way, as you see with Donald Trump, is exactly the opposite. Trump, and I think Trump is providing a model that I'm afraid Europe is taking. Trump is sort of saying we're going to impose tariffs and sanctions on every other country of the world, awful sanctions to every country. We're saying we can destroy your economy. And the other countries, Mexico and France and Canada, for starters, are saying, well, don't do that. And Trump then will say, okay, if we don't destroy you, what are you going to do that benefits us? He's done the same to law firms in the United States, the same to universities. We're going to pull out all of your spending, and if you don't follow a Zionist policy for us, and they'll say, well, what do we have to do to get the funding back so that we can do research and development? And Trump is laying down the neocon policies they have to take, and Columbia University has led the surrender. I think this is the mentality that Europe is trying to emulate, but it doesn't have anything to threaten other countries with. It can't threaten them with sanctions because other countries can say, okay, don't trade with us. We don't need you. We're self-sufficient by ourselves. The whole rest of the world is trying to be self-sufficient, and almost every region is trying to be self-sufficient, so it's not dependent on other countries, so that it can follow its own self-interest. But Europe has destroyed its own self-sufficiency by Nord Stream and by the sanctions against Russia, by seizing Russia's $300 billion that it had in Belgium and the Euroclear. It's isolated itself from the rest of the world. How on earth can it have anything to gain militarily or politically, even if it were military successful? What can it gain from the rest of the world by isolating itself when the whole rest of the world is divided into new regional geographic uh, groupings? It's as if it's left Western Eurasia, Europe, is a kind of abandoned area. I won't say it's a rust belt like the United States abandoned industrial cities, but it's more than that. What it is thought of as its national identity, its historical understanding, its idea that it is a political, moral, intellectual leadership of the world has become a fantasy. How do you ever undergo the psychological healing of that kind of self-inflicted wound that has been sweeping Europe like a disease over the last few years?
Yes, this self-harm has almost become a expression of solidarity or virtue that we're willing to sacrifice all of national interest to stand up against our evil opponent. It's very, it's. I feel that we need to replace some of our social scientists and political scientists with psychologists because it's becoming a very strange thing to observe. But I agree with this focus on diversification because I think this is a point which has been to some extent lost over the past decade. That is when Russia began to organize its economy towards the east, really intensifying it since 2014. Many saw it as, well, are they trying to elevate their own market value for Europe so they have more bargaining power to integrate with Europe on a more equal footing? Or is it to be join an anti-European bloc? But all possible hypotheses were all very Europe-centric. That is, how does Russia want to reorganize its position towards Europe based on this? But the main idea for the Russians was they want to make Europe matter less. That it's we can trade with them, but it shouldn't be that important anymore. We shouldn't have to be pro-European or anti-European. We just shouldn't have to focus on Europe as much as we've done in the past. And I think this is quite distinctive, and you see this now in the political sphere how they're organizing, but of course the economy reorganizing to the east, and it falls in all spheres. You see it on the technology, the industries with all this new transportation corridors by land and sea, the payment systems, the new banks, the trade in currencies, um, yeah, establishing new commodity exchanges, insurance systems. It's quite extensive in the economic as well. But you mentioned the culture, because in the Cold War, at least towards the end of the Cold War, there was still hostility between our governments, but among the Soviet public and the Russians, there was a sentiment uh, that the Western way of lifestyle was quite attractive. This is kind of gone now. It's not. They don't want to remodel, well, shape their countries like the West anymore. So I think this is quite new. But you did mention something else which I found interesting, which is on the economic side, the EU, which has begun to steal the Russian national reserves. Well, so far they have taken the proceeds from these reserves, suggesting that this is okay. This is not theft if they just take this. But now there's talk about seizing, the full 300 billion, and well, some are suggesting that in the future peace deal, they should be, accepting that Russia has to give up this money, maybe transfer it into a reconstruction fund, but even if the Russians would accept such a reconstruction fund, it would be under pressure to get something back in return. So either way, this is already theft, as we have seen. Again, it's not just freezing funds, which is also devastating for trust, but it's actually, yeah, theft. So how do you see how have you seen the world reacting to this? I mean, gold is up. Is this a consequence of it, or well, well, if you would, well, I guess, do a speech for the European Union, what would be your main warning against what has been done here? Because this is truly dramatic. It hasn't been done before. But again, I think the Europeans, they get swept up in their own narratives and morality that, Russia attacked Ukraine, so it's just fair that they have to repay for construction. But this is a very weird argument because this has never happened before. You don't America, the Europeans, we have also invaded other countries. The idea that the rest of the world should go and seize our money and hand it over to the countries we invaded, this would just diminish the trust in the entire international financial system. So, how do you how do you see this impacting the world?
Well, Glenn, you began by mentioning Europe's opponents, and that's the problem. Europe views the whole rest of the world as negotiating with an opponent. Now, think of how different the rhetoric of European diplomacy is from that of Putin in Russia. Putin always refers to other countries as his partners, as if somehow the only way that we can have relations with each other that are voluntary is each of us gain. So we're partners, we're not opponents. Europe has followed really the Donald Trump view is, well, just like Trump says, America has to be the gainer in any transaction. Europe has to be the gainer because the rest of the world is viewed as an opponent by Europe. And with that psychology, with that attitude, which is just what Lavrov was talking about, they are doomed to failure. And you can the $300 billion that the Euroclear sees. I can imagine Putin has a very good answer. He'll say, "Well, of course we're going to spend the 300 billion on reconstruction. No, we're quite happy to do that. We're going to. There's been an enormous destruction of civilian buildings and territory in Luhansk." In Donetsk and the other Russian provinces that have now, the parts of Ukraine that have now joined Russia. We realize that it's going to take $300 billion to reconstruct, but we're going to do this. Unfortunately, we don't see any reason to spend any of this 300 billion on European construction firms or European industrial firms in helping rebuild these areas because you've fallen into economic obsolescence as a result of your economic obsolescence. It didn't have to be technological obsolescence, although you're way behind Asia in that, but it's really economic obsolescence. And quite frankly, you charge too much because of the way you've privatized and neoliberalized your economy. So yes, we'll spend the 300 billion, but I think we're going to have other countries participate because we don't have a large enough industrial population to do that. We're going to hire Asians and other people from other areas to do this construction. But have no fear, this 300 billion will be spent on reconstructing the attacks on the civilian areas that the Europeans and Americans have destroyed by backing the neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine. What do you think of that rhetoric?
This sounds, yeah, familiar. As this is my thought, yeah, come out as well. No, it's. I'm just thinking, yeah, this is what the Russians want to spend on, yeah, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, but also if you look at all the problems of the Europeans now, cut themselves off from all these other centers of power, that is first the Russians, then de-risking from the Chinese, and then yeah, cutting a lot of, burning down a lot of bridges, and then at this point, the Americans decide that they are more or less deprioritizing Europe. And now, of course, things are bad enough as we're paying a lot of money for energy, which costs deindustrialization, and then the goal is to just build weapons, and somehow this is going to be the solution. But making matters much worse is even if the war in Ukraine finishes tomorrow, it's the reconstruction of the country. This is going to be a huge mess for years to come, and the Americans seem to have, well, at least Trump appears to be washing his hands with this and handing it over to the Europeans. So the Europeans will have a big mess to finance over the coming years, and I just, it's very hard to see how any of this can not result in a massive crisis and even, yes, you said collapse, but I guess my final question is on the alternatives here, because as the old system or the old dies, countries want to look for alternatives. One of Europe doesn't seem to have any alternatives yet, but the rest of the world do. They seem to be looking towards institutions such as BRICS to again reorganize technological industrial cooperation, to have the physical connectivity with these corridors, and of course financial connectivity. So they are doing all of this, and it appears to be intensifying under BRICS. But for Trump, he for all the talks about multipolarity, he doesn't like the idea of BRICS de-dollarizing, and Do you see it as has this train already left the station, or do you think Trump can stop it? Because he threatened that he said, "Well, BRICS is pretty much done already because I threatened to put tariffs on them if they don't use our dollar." But this is, I guess, fails to appreciate the main problem. The reason why they're diversifying through the BRICS institution is because they do not trust the US dollar anymore because, well, I guess all the economic levers of power can be weaponized. But by threatening to use the access, well, to further weaponize the dependence on the US in order to maintain dependence on the US, surely he must be aware of this contradiction that yeah, threatening other countries with sanction only will convince them the need to diversify and decouple. But still, America's not a weak country. It has a lot of economic power. So, do you see the Trump being able to stop this thing, or is it too late?
Well, America has become a weak economy, even though it's not a weak country. It has the atom bomb. It has political influence to get other countries to impose sanctions against countries that don't follow American policy. But the fact is that the Trump in the United States is in almost as weak a position as Europe is. There's nothing that it has to offer other countries except we will not hurt you if you do what we tell you to do. What we'll do for you is not bomb you. Well, that's not really offering very much. I want to mention, you mentioned Ukraine is the following issue, and how about the reconstruction of Ukraine? What is left of Ukraine, and it's not going to be very much, nobody's going to fix it. Nobody has the money, and nobody cares. Just like they don't seem to care about Gaza. Ukraine has run up enormous debts to the International Monetary Fund, to Europe, to other people and other countries and official institutions, and it can't pay. Europe is not going to pay. The United States is not going to pay. Russia certainly is not going to pay. Russia is going to be concerned with rebuilding that part of Russia that used to be Ukraine. So that's going forward. And again, there's nothing that either Russia or China needs from the United States or Europe. And again and again, you have every week in the Financial Times, you have some German or European saying it's unfair for China to export more to us than we're exporting to it. And China's response is the same every week. Well, we'd love to import more from you. For instance, that Dutch firm that's making the engraving equipment, a couple of 10 or $20 million per machine. We'd love to buy it. You're refusing to trade with us because you're following the American sanctions. So you're not willing to sell us anything that we want. Because again, you're viewing us as America's enemy, and you've thrown all of your bets on the American side, and that's why our trade is bad. Well, the Europeans then have your narrative again, saying, well, if we import more from another country, that's dependency. Well, the whole idea of free trade for 2 centuries has been you're trading in order to make a gain. The gains from trade theory is what international economics is all about. Well, Europe is politicians say there are no gains from trade. Any trade is only a dependency that lets other countries stop the trade if they want to hurt us. Well, of course, Russia never stopped the trade with Europe. It's Europe that stopped the trade with us. So other countries are fearful of even trading with Europe or the United States to establish a dependency that would enable Trump in America or Merz in Europe to say, all right, we're going to try to destabilize your economy by stopping our exports to you that you need, and we're going to interrupt your supply chains. No other country is willing to let its supply chains be based on Europe or the United States. Their supply chains are based on each other. And so the supply chains that are being split up are in Europe and the United States now with Trump's tariffs right now. So you're seeing an economic crisis in the United States caused by Trump's idea that somehow you can isolate the United States and reindustrialize almost overnight, as if you can create factories in the remaining 3 years of his administration instead of over a 10-year planning period. I won't even get into what the US problems are, but the United States and Europe together have painted themselves into a corner that they can't get out of. And that's why it's impossible to make a prediction of how Europe and the United States are going to achieve their self-interest when they don't understand what their self-interest is. They don't understand how the economy really works. And how do you anticipate and project the future of a continent, Europe or the United States, that doesn't understand how the economy works or its self-interest and is floundering? That's what you're seeing right now, and there are so many possibilities of floundering. The scattershot approach of Trump is, I think, what you're going to be seeing in Europe. Try this, but it's just flaying without any idea of a how to go about creating a productive economy to do in Europe what China has done to rebuild its economy, or what Russia is trying to do to rebuild its economy. That's what's so striking in all of this. It doesn't make sense from a materialistic approach to history.
I guess this is a problem of having had the unipolar moment. That is, the whole world was excessively dependent on the collective West, while the West was less dependent on any one state or region, which meant that any concern about economic dependency being weaponized was only a problem for others. So now waking up to this reality and yeah, uncertain how to react. Again, I wish we would. Revive some of the ideas from yeah, from Alexander Hamilton or Friedrich List or Sergei Witte, someone who defining the industrialization and economic power more as an intrinsic part of political independence. And but still, one doesn't have to cut oneself off from the world. The sufficient thing is to diversify, to just have a variety of partners, and this is what the rest of the world is doing. But we are not. And I always make this point because it's quite shocking what's happening in Europe. The main idea is that the United States is weakening and is going other places. So, what a rational, sensible policy would be, it would be to diversify ties. That is to, yes, keep and hand out to the Americans, but also reach out to the Russians, Chinese, and other centers of power and yeah, diversify, but instead, and also find a way of seeking some collective bargaining power based on shared national interest within the EU bloc. But instead, it's yeah, this yeah, we're surrounded by this political midgets who can't accept that we have moved on and that the world is changing. So they're trying to reach out and show their value to the United States by subordinating themselves even further, just doing anything America say, and then hope that this would convince America that Europe is still an important partner and America won't leave us. But again, America has less resources and shifting those resources and focus other places. But it's just the willingness to accept reality is just completely gone. And again, this is not an exaggeration. I see the political leadership in Germany accusing, saying, well, the reason why I have economic trouble is because the Russians cut off the energy supply to us. So no, they did not. It was the Germans who cut this. You know, how is it possible that they get away with this? And also, yeah, Nord Stream tried to pin this on the Russians. Then we found out, yeah, it wasn't the Russians, and now nobody wants to talk about it anymore because there's no good narratives left. It's just, it's such a huge mess. I think the first step towards fixing Europe and the political West, I guess, would be to first address, well, restore some reason and rationality, because I think we, yeah, lost this a while ago when we got entangled in our own narratives. Anyways, Michael Hudson, I've already kept you way too long, so yeah, thank you so much again for taking the time, and yeah, it's always a great pleasure to speak with you.
Well, I hope that you're successful, Glenn, in trying to raise the concept of rationality and reality to the rest of Europe.
As political realists, the assumption is always the rational state. So the foundation of the political theory is now missing. It's a quite a troubling time. Anyways, thanks again.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.